Soviet engineers examined captured B-29. Stalin ordered, "Copy everything." November 1944. 3 American B-29 Superfortress bombers make emergency landings in Soviet territory after bombing raids on Japan. The crews expect to be treated as allies, refueled, and sent home. Instead, Soviet guards immediately surround the aircraft. The American crews are politely but firmly separated from their planes. Within hours, the B-29s are being disassembled, measured, and photographed. Within days, they're transported to secret facilities near Moscow. And within weeks, Joseph Stalin issues an order to his aviation industry that will reshape Soviet strategic air power for decades. Copy everything, every rivet, every wire, every bolt. Create an exact duplicate of the American B-29. Not similar, not inspired by, exact down to the last detail. This is the story of one of the most audacious reverse engineering projects in history. The story of how the Soviet Union, struggling to build modern strategic bombers, stole the design of America's most advanced aircraft. And how that theft gave the Soviets the capability to deliver atomic weapons to American cities during the Cold War. To understand why Stalin was so desperate to copy the B-29, you need to understand Soviet strategic bombing capability in 1944. It was essentially non-existent. The Soviet Air Force was built around tactical aircraft. These aircraft were excellent for their intended roles. The IL-2 Stormovik ground attack aircraft was one of the most effective weapons of the war. Soviet fighters like the Yak-3 and Law-7 could match German aircraft in combat. But the Soviets had nothing comparable to American or British heavy bombers. They had no aircraft capable of carrying large bomb loads deep into enemy territory. No strategic bombing force that could threaten industrial targets hundreds of miles behind the front lines. Soviet attempts to develop heavy bombers had largely failed. The TB-7, also known as the Pay-8, was the Soviet Union's only operational long-range bomber. Fewer than 100 were built during the entire war. They were mechanically unreliable, difficult to maintain, and carried relatively small bomb loads compared to American B-7s or British Lancasters. Soviet industry simply lacked the experience designing and building large complex aircraft, with pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and sophisticated flight control systems. Then the Soviets got their hands on 3 B-29s. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber in the world in 1944. It was pressurized, allowing it to fly at high altitudes where enemy fighters struggled to intercept. It had remote-controlled gun turrets linked to analog fire control computers. It carried up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. Its range exceeded 3,000 meter. It was powered by 4 massive Wright 3350 engines producing over 2,000 horsepower each. The B-29 was more than just a bomber. It was a technological marvel incorporating cutting-edge developments in aerodynamics, engines, electronics, and material science. American engineers had spent years and billions of dollars developing it, and now 3 of them were sitting on Soviet airfields. The first B-29 landed in Soviet territory in July 1944, after a bombing mission against Japan. The crew was interned. The aircraft was immediately impounded. Stalin ordered it preserved carefully. He wanted to study it. In November, 2 more B-29s made emergency landings after bombing runs. Stalin now had 3 complete examples of America's most sophisticated bomber. He wanted his own. Stalin summoned Andrei Tupolev, the Soviet Union's leading aircraft designer. Tupolev had been imprisoned during the Great Purges of the late 1930s, accused of sabotage and anti-Soviet activities. He spent years in a prison design bureau, forced to work on aircraft projects while officially a prisoner. He was released in 1943 and put in charge of developing new bombers. Now Stalin had a new assignment for him. Copy the B-29, not exactly. Tupolev protested. He explained that Soviet industry used metric measurements while American industry used imperial measurements. Converting the designs would require recalculating every dimension, every specification. It would be simpler to study the B-29's design principles and create a similar Soviet aircraft using Soviet measurements and Soviet manufacturing techniques. Stalin refused. He wanted an exact copy. If the Americans built it with inches, the Soviets would build it with inches converted to millimeters. If the Americans used a particular alloy, the Soviets would duplicate that alloy. If the Americans put a rivet in a specific location, the Soviets would put a rivet in that exact location. Copy everything. Tupolev had no choice. The project began immediately. Soviet engineers descended on the 3 B-29s like archaeologists examining ancient artifacts. Every component was metallurgy couldn't immediately explain. Plastics and rubber compounds with unusual characteristics, electronic components built to specifications Soviet factories had never attempted. Everything had to be analyzed, reverse engineered, and replicated. The Wright R3350 engines presented enormous challenges. These were among the most powerful piston engines ever built. They used advanced cooling systems, sophisticated fuel injection, and complex reduction gearing. Soviet engineers had to completely disassemble the engines, measure every component, determine the metallurgy of every part, and figure out how to manufacture Soviet equivalents. The remote-controlled gun turrets baffled Soviet engineers. Initially, the B-29 had 5 turrets, each containing 2 50-caliber machine guns. These turrets were aimed and fired by gunners, sitting at fire control stations inside the pressurized cabin. Analog computers calculated lead angles based on target speed and direction. The system was far more sophisticated than anything in Soviet aircraft. Engineers had to reverse engineer the mechanical computers, the electric motors that moved the turrets, the ammunition feed systems, everything. Even seemingly simple components presented problems. The Americans used adhesives that Soviet industry didn't produce. They used paints and coatings with specific properties. They used specialized fasteners and hardware. In some cases, Soviet engineers could find equivalents. In other cases, they had to develop entirely new materials and manufacturing processes. Stalin's order to copy everything meant that even if a Soviet alternative existed, if it wasn't identical to the American component, it couldn't be used. The project consumed enormous resources. Thousands of engineers, technicians, and factory workers were assigned to the B-29 copying program. New manufacturing facilities had to be built. New tools had to be designed. Workers had to be trained in unfamiliar techniques. Approximately 900 Soviet factories were involved in producing components for the copied B-29. The aircraft that emerged from this massive effort was designated the Tupolev T-4. To anyone who didn't know better, it looked identical to the B-29. Same wingspan, same fuselage shape, same engines, same gun turrets. The resemblance was so exact that American intelligence initially refused to believe the Soviets had actually manufactured the aircraft. They assumed the Soviets were simply flying captured B-29s, but there were differences. Subtle ones forced by Soviet manufacturing limitations. The Soviet engines, while copied from the Wright R3350, used different internal materials because exact American alloys couldn't be replicated. Some electronic components used vacuum tubes with slightly different specifications. The Soviet metric system meant that supposedly identical dimensions were actually fractionally different, converted from inches to millim and rounded. These tiny differences accumulated throughout the aircraft, creating maintenance challenges. Parts from one T-4 wouldn't always fit perfectly in another T-4, but overall the copying effort succeeded remarkably well. The T-4 could fly almost as far, almost as high, and carry almost as much as the B-29. And most importantly, it could carry atomic bombs. The first Tu-4 flew in May 1947, less than 3 years after the first B-29 landed in Soviet territory. Production began immediately. By 1949, the Soviets had over 300 Tu-4s in service. The aircraft gave the Soviet Union its first credible strategic bombing capability. More importantly, when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, the Tu-4 became the delivery system. American military planners suddenly faced a terrifying reality. Soviet bombers, copies of American designs, could deliver Soviet atomic weapons to targets throughout Europe and potentially even North America. The strategic balance of the early Cold War was fundamentally altered by Stalin's decision to copy the B-29. American officials were furious when they learned about the Tu-4. The copying violated no laws technically. The United States and Soviet Union were not at war. No treaty prohibited reverse engineering captured equipment. But American engineers who had spent years developing the B-29 were outraged to see their work duplicated so blatantly. The U.S. military began taking precautions to prevent future technology theft. Aircraft that made emergency landings in unfriendly territory were to be destroyed if possible. Sensitive equipment was to be removed or rendered inoperable before abandoning aircraft. But the damage was done. The Soviets had the technology. The Tu-4 served as the backbone of Soviet strategic aviation until the mid-1950s when it was replaced by jet-powered bombers. But its impact extended far beyond its service life. The knowledge Soviet engineers gained from copying the B-29 accelerated Soviet aviation development. Techniques learned during the 24 project were applied to subsequent designs. The experience building pressurized cabins, complex engines, and sophisticated control systems gave Soviet industry capabilities it previously lacked. In a sense, copying the B-29 was like attending an intensive engineering course taught by America's best aviation designers, with the actual aircraft serving as the textbook. For Tupolev, the project was professionally frustrating, but ultimately career-enhancing. He hated being ordered to copy rather than design, but the success of the Tu-4 restored his reputation and gave him resources for future projects. His design bureau would go on to create some of the Soviet Union's most important aircraft, including the Tu-95 Bear bomber and the 2144 supersonic transport. The American crews whose emergency landings gave Stalin his B-29s were eventually returned to the United States, but only after lengthy internment. They were debriefed extensively about Soviet interest in their aircraft. American intelligence wanted to know everything the Soviets had asked, every component they seemed interested in, every question they asked about performance and capabilities. The B-29 copying project revealed something important about Soviet industrial strategy during the Cold War. When the Soviet Union couldn't match Western technology through original development, it simply copied Western designs, sometimes through espionage, sometimes through examination of captured equipment, sometimes through purchasing Western technology through front companies. The approach had advantages and disadvantages. Copying was faster than original development. It guaranteed a certain level of performance since the original worked. It avoided expensive research dead ends. But copying also meant the Soviets were always behind, building yesterday's technology while the West moved on to tomorrow's. And copied designs often worked less reliably than originals, because subtle manufacturing differences accumulated into performance problems. The 24 exemplified both the successes and limitations of this approach. It gave the Soviet Union strategic bombing capability years earlier than original development would have, but it was obsolete almost as soon as it entered service, inferior to the jet bombers America was already developing. When Soviet engineers examined the captured B-29 and Stalin ordered, "Copy everything," they set in motion a project that would give the Soviet Union the ability to threaten American cities with atomic weapons. It was one of the most consequential reverse engineering projects in history. And it all started with 3 American bombers making emergency landings in Soviet territory in 1944.